So now let's talk about problems of uncertainty and directionality. Because I'm sure that many of you may have arrived at this point in the talk and had a feeling a little bit like the two guys to the blackboard with some mathematics, and in the middle the caption is, "Then a miracle occurs." Okay? And the caption at the bottom is, "I think you should be more explicit here in step 2, the one in which the miracle happens." So frame 3 is based upon a theory of social change. Okay? So there are many theories of social change. Frame 3 is based upon an idea called the multi-level perspective, or if you prefer, multi-level perspective. So this perspective views society as having 3 fundamental structures in it. One structure is the landscape. The landscape is the set of rules, norms, social customs, culture, laws that apply to activities within the society. It also encompasses, the landscape also encompasses social opinion. So what is viewed as a normal thing, which we often refer to as social norms. That landscape then typically reinforces the reproduction and continuation of particular ways of doing things. What Nelson and Winter would refer to as organizational routines, and what socio-technical scholars, transition scholars, see as regimes within society. So a regime is an ordering of actors, purposes, and methods that tends to be reproduced over time and reinforced over time into a pattern of incumbency. And the problem here is that incumbent regime is often incompatible with making a deep transition. But at a more basic level, if we think about how fundamental change occurs in society, it's a question of how alternatives percolate from small to large, how they're replicated, spread. Economists would like the word diffused, how they circulate within society. From an initial instance, a localized context, more broadly. Okay. Until the point that they may challenge the existing regime. What we call those bubbles, the percolation bubbles that change the regime, we call those niches. Okay. So it's not obvious or certain that a niche can exist because the incumbent ways of doing things are very powerful. Okay. You want to make a steam-powered automobile? Yeah, well, maybe you can. And maybe you can sell it to 200 or 300 people. Okay? So there's a problem here, okay? That niches have a lot of resistances and barriers to overcome if they are to replace the existing regime. And we'd like to put things in pictures, and this is the picture that we come up with in depicting the process of social change in the multi-level perspective. the MLP, the multi-level perspective, suggests that change occurs when there are pressures on the existing regime from the landscape and when niches are able to become aligned to create a new configuration. What does that mean? Well, in London, I live beside the Thames. And it's fortunate that I live beside the Thames in 2019 and not some earlier century. Because in an earlier century, the Thames was a sewer. Okay? And the place in London where I lived was the Docklands. And in the Docklands, there were piles and piles of manure, with all the things that come with manure. Regimes had to change in order for that place that I live in to be a fair place to live. Okay? Now, I'm not implying that the changes were made in order to accommodate my lifestyle, but fortunately they were made because people resisted the existing regime and because alternatives were available. Okay? Similarly, if I had lived there during the 1960s, it would have been very punishing. Air quality is not really good as it is, better alongside the river, but London air quality in the 50s and the 60s was still very much shaped by coal consumption. Okay? And the famous London fog was largely pollution. Okay? So what happened in those various regimes that I've mentioned, horse-drawn carriage, okay? The idea of public sanitation, okay? So the question of how sanitation is organized, and the question of how energy is generated, were all systems that have changed in the last century. Okay? They've changed through this process of an incumbent regime which was merrily reproducing itself from generation to generation, coming under pressure from the regime, from the landscape, from the people's ideas about how the world should be, and from pressure from below, from alternatives that were offered to the existing regime. The combination of the two is the powerful instrument by which change is occurring. Paloma.
Thank you. Can you tell us what those little arrows represent in the graph?
These arrows here are niches which aren't necessarily going anywhere. Okay? There's a steam automobile at the period in which the regime of the petrol and diesel-fueled automobile taking control of the mobility regime. These arrows, the red ones, are an indication that some of those niches have been selected out as being able to actively contest the existing incumbent regime. And because they're becoming more aligned with it, there's a real possibility that they'll simply be co-opted within it. Okay? There's no necessity that they replace it. Okay? They may be included within it by some adaptation. On the other hand, they may represent a significant enough departure that there is really an alternative regime which is very different than the past. And so as we move from the left to the right, which is a movement in time, we're developing a new configuration, whether it be a configuration that involves the co-optation or the replacement of the prior regime. One more idea about uncertainty and directionality here. This is really the same kind of diagram as I had a moment ago. It's another way to understand regime change, which is more schematic. It separates out two ideas. One is that the routines represent rules or ways of doing things. So if I have a rule such as make things with no attention to recycling. So make things to throw away. Okay? That may change. Okay? People may observe we're using more and more of our land as landfill. Okay? And that interferes with our food security. Landfill sites leach pollution into the groundwater and so forth and so on. We may come to resist and in fact find society to be too wasteful. And the rule might change to make things be recyclable or reusable. It might become a social norm. You're only willing to buy things that are recyclable or reusable. People are forced to produce things that are recyclable or reusable by law. A variety of possible ways to get there, but those ways amount to external pressure for change, which has the effect of, on the stable, dominant socio-technical regime, of eroding it and making it unstable. So a movement from the upper right-hand corner in which the stability of the rules is high and the percentage of population using the rules is also high, towards a low stability of the rules and a declining number of people that are using those rules. But then it's quite important that there be some alternative, okay? That someone actually be making things that are recyclable or reusable, okay? And that comes out of the niches that we saw in the previous diagram. And those niches evolve to offer an alternative to the regime. And as they evolve, as in the red arrows in the previous diagram, they converge and align in a way that makes them possible substitutes in which we can have a wide breakthrough and the regime grows to be the new regime, the new stable dominant regime. So this is the theory of social change. You see that it emphasizes the significance of niches, of eruptions of novelty and change, their incorporation and embedding through a process of competition aided by external pressures, with the possibility that those niches might be embedded or inside the existing regime merely as reforms. So finally here on the underlying theory, there is the question and the use of the word directionality. This is a favorite word of my colleague Andy Sterling, and I think is a very well-chosen word to speak about the path that technology takes over time, because it not only incorporates the fact that we know from research that much of technical change is incremental, occurs in small steps, and builds upon the immediate past achievements, and therefore has a degree of predictability to it. But also that incremental process describes a trajectory that has a direction. And that direction for most of the history of after the first deep transition was increasing energy intensity. So once upon a time, there was a very modest use of energy on the farm because energy meant human and animal labor. Then we have mechanization of agriculture. Then we have artificial fertilizers, which are produced through energy-intensive processes. We have further chemical additives, which further use energy in the production of food. And all of this has a benefit, which is more and cheaper food, but it also has a cost in terms of the sustainability of the agricultural system. So if we talk about that process across many socio-technical systems, we can see a series of eruptions which could be thought of as surges in productivity and output. So one of these, for example, is the surge in the use of petroleum rather than coal. And another might be the use of natural gas rather than petroleum. Okay? They're all following along this trajectory that was established in the first deep transition. At the same time, we have a collection of arrows again. Okay? These niches that are going in different directions, some of them more aligned with the existing energy-intensive use, some of them less aligned. And if there is to be a second deep transition, those arrows have to accumulate and become more aligned so that they can influence the development of a new trajectory, a new path, a new direction.